Happy holidays to our loyal listeners and new listeners.
Disloyal listeners, we'll take them all.
Yeah, and any listeners who happen to be looking for that podcast for their road trips. And nothing says happy holidays like murder. That's what I always say.
That's the house we grew up in, certainly.
Very murderous, very murdery. Yes.
In fact, actually, I have been known to love some true crime. And
oh, really?
Recently, I've decided that maybe I've taken it a little far, and I'm going to take a step back in the new year. It's one of my resolutions. And yet, we decided to do this episode, so this is like my last hurrah.
Yeah, so it starts after this.
Yeah, it starts after this. Yeah.
Okay. What is too far?
Well, not too far, just too much. Specifically, I was listening to something on the John Benet Ramsey case, which is one of the ones that like I always knew about, but just her picture, everything creeped me out. I kind of stayed away from it. And then I was listening to it, and it was just, I think normal people, like when they listen to horrific stories of crimes, they get creeped out. That does not normally happen to me. This time I got really creeped out.
So you finally found something that hit a nerve.
Yeah, it just really was too much. I don't know if it was her age, all things with children are terrible, but the fact that it was like the day after Christmas, it was not
and
not
you
good
also have a child now.
Right.
So
I think that's the difference. Yeah.
Because to your point about normal people and their reactions, I think one of the reasons why we chose this particular topic today is because really the normal reaction in today's society when it comes to murder is fascination.
Absolutely.
And sensationalism in the media and wanting as much information as possible. I mean, like that's my timeline right now, as is most people with the murder of the UHC CEO. I know I'm constantly looking up updates of the Gilgo Beach murder, which is also very kind of scarily similar to our topic today as well. So I think, unfortunately, maybe the normal reaction these days to murder is, we're a little numb to it.
We are. And there's also like a sense of entitlement to the details, which I can think of a few more high profile murder cases in recent history where law enforcement and the court system kept the details kind of close to the vest, even through the court cases. And people were very upset about that. They just want to know everything, and they want to know it immediately.
Right. Yeah, because we're entitled to it, like you said. And that's not that's not a modern thing, because we're going to be talking about the 19th century. We're talking about Jack the Ripper case, which is probably one of the most, if not the most famous cold cases, because it was never solved. And this was in the late 1800s. And if you want to talk about, it being all over any type of news at that day, which was, publication, which was newsprint.
Their TikToks were popping.
China hadn't gotten involved in TikTok then, so it was still allowed. But yeah, people wanted more. They wanted all the information. They were scared, but at the same time fascinated. So again, that's not just like a modern happening.
Yeah, And especially with cases like this or the Gilgo Beach murders that you mentioned, there's that element of class or status, which it's like, oh, okay, this is not something that would happen to me. And therefore, like, it's easier for me to kind of get like the thrill out of it,
Right.
or the voyeurism, because this is not something that happens to people like me.
Right. But then, like you said, there is clearly a time when it starts to hit home a little more in your case with John Benet Ramsey, right? Being like a child. So today we're gonna switch our vibe a little. We're gonna be a little bit of a true crime podcast here. And that's because, why is that? Why are we talking about Jack the Ripper, other than the fact that I think it's a fascinating case and I love mysteries and detective and I love England and I love 19th century England. But there is an
There's even
actual
more.
tie. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, because actually this is a perfect topic to talk about the two things we always talk about, which are royals and the brain. So as we'll get to, one of the more out there theories of Jack the Ripper's identity is that he was actually the heir to the British throne, Prince Albert Victor.
Yes. Fascinating. We've both known about this rumor in the past, having read about royals or Jack the Ripper. If you Google his name, that is like the headlining topic. So we're going to talk about whether it was true or not. Either way, history has put his name and Jack the Ripper together forever. So really excited about getting into some murdery murder today. So I'm gonna give a little overview of this case and what was happening, just for those who maybe need a refresher or aren't familiar with the case. So we're going back to England, to the London area in 1888. These murders happened in a series of a few months. So this was between September and November of 1888. And historians disagree with the final body count of Jack the Ripper. By the way, Jack, not his real name. Jack the Ripper, not his real name. We assume.
It's not his middle name.
Yeah, Jack the Ripper. That name came from a letter that police received with a confession, basically, about the murders, and that's how it was signed. So people just continued to call him that. If that letter was in fact from the real killer, of course, it could have been a hoax, but either way, it was unfortunately fitting for what happened to these victims. So historians agree there were at least 5 female victims of Jack the Ripper. There could have been 6 or 7. The reason why there's disagreement is how the bodies were found. So Jack the Ripper's MO was to slit the woman's throat and cut them up and dismember them. I was actually reading something. I don't recommend this, and I didn't realize this was in there, but there's like old photographs of the crime scene. So like 1800s photographs, and it's pretty alarming.
Yeah.
Even like with the photographs back then and the clarity. So that was how the bodies were found. Some of the other women that may or may not have been involved had similar, were found in similar states, but maybe not all the way. So there is some disagreement. But there were some common threads between the women. They were all of a certain lower class. They all were had either dabbled in prostitution or were rumored to be prostitutes. Whether or not that was true, they all had some type of, whether they knew someone or were living with someone, whatever. And then they all were very heavy drinkers and were most likely intoxicated the night of the murder. So we have at least 5 women who were brutally murdered, and those are the things that kind of tie them together. So we could ask ourselves, why was it so hard to find the murderer? Why do we not still know who it is? Some of those things are obvious. There weren't cameras everywhere. Fingerprints weren't used weren't collected and used as clues. That didn't really start until actually a few years after these murders in Argentina, and it probably wasn't reliable for many years, if decades after that. DNA testing wasn't used for another 100 years. I think we talked about that in another one of our episodes.
Romanov,
yeah. So even if they found things at the crime scene, it didn't matter. They didn't really even know that was an option. I know that today they've tried to test some things with some levels of success. And then also what I thought was interesting, and this kind of ties into during this period where science was still we're always learning things about medicine and science that's evolving. But even 100 years ago, their knowledge was vastly different than ours, to the point where some scientists actually believed that a victim's retinas could tell them what the last images were that they saw when they died. So if you could take a picture of the retinas or somehow remove the eye and see that there'd be a photo of their last memory in the murder case would be of the murderer. So these are kind of things that they're thinking about when they're looking at a crime scene. They had started to collect evidence, so they were doing their due diligence that way, but then there were just some theories that now we know today are kind of ridiculous to think about. So those are the reasons why we still don't know who it was today. Also worth noting is this was a time of, and still is the case, there was a lot of negativity and a lot of suspicion of immigrants. And that was only perpetuated through the tabloids and magazines and theories that people had. Obviously, when something bad happens, you look to the outside or the other. In this case, it was Jewish immigrants was at the top of the list of suspects. So,
right, because all of these murders happened in the same area of Whitechapel, right, in London.
They happened in the same area.
And that was kind of a hub of Jewish immigrants.
Yep. There was a dock where near there, the shipyard. So people were coming in from around the world. So it really was kind of the perfect place to escape or disappear. So yes. So even though we don't know, and maybe we'll never know who Jack the Ripper really was, there is a fascinating list of suspects that have come up, specifically famous ones that you and I would recognize. I thought the most fascinating one is Lewis Carroll, who, if you don't know, is the author of Alice in Wonderland.
It does seem pretty crazy. That's a whack story.
Okay, so I read, is it Beyond the Looking Glass? Horrible. Horrible. Nightmares. Worse than any murder documented. That man was twisted. Was he twisted enough to murder and dismember women? Probably not. But there were some other authors who said that they found some anagrams in his writings that pointed to the murder.
I love that.
That was just someone with too much time on a rabbit hole.
They wished,
no pun intended,
those authors would love Taylor Swift.
Yes, they were born in the wrong time. So Alice in Wonderland author Lord Randolph Churchill, who was the father of Winston Churchill, who we all know and love. H.H. Holmes. He is a famous American serial killer. If you love murder and you love history and you love reading and you have not read Devil in the White City by Eric Larson, I ask you, what are you doing? And you need to read it immediately.
It is so good.
It's so good because it's written like fiction, and that's why I love him so much. But it is about a real man, probably one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, who killed maybe as many as 30 people, hid them in his murder house. Incredible. So there are a lot of theories that this same man who was over in England at some point could have done this, and his own descendants actually agree that he could have done it.
And he was dubbed, I think, as the first serial killer.
Right.
Like, I think that's part of why Jack the Ripper was such a subject of fascination, is because like there was no term serial killer then.
Right.
Like there was no idea that someone would be committing murders over and over and over again.
Yeah.
So that is
On
an
purpose
interesting,
with like a plan. And
right.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So the idea that this like first identified serial killer could be responsible for the Jack the Ripper serial killings is definitely interesting.
Yeah, it's probably one of the most fascinating theories to me, because there are a lot of things that you're like, oh, that lines up. But I think it's been pretty much debunked. But definitely read about him. Amazing story. Francis Tumblety. You don't know him. I didn't know him. But what I thought was fascinating was that he was also accused of being involved with Lincoln's assassination. So this man got around. He was apparently in England being Jack the Ripper, and also in America trying to assassinate Lincoln. So he had quite the career,
busy boy,
if you were to believe it. But we're going to focus on, like we mentioned, Prince Albert Victor, who was known as Eddie to his family. He was the grandson of Queen Victoria. So before Queen Elizabeth, who recently passed, she was the longest reigning monarch in England. That's correct, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
It's women. It was
you're the historian.
Yeah, I know. Sometimes I just like to be, confirmed. But I'm pretty sure because she was a queen of UK from 1837 to 1901. So she had quite the reign. His father was Edward VII, who was his father's Prince of Wales, who was next in line to the throne to Victoria, which meant that Prince Albert was after his father. So he was second in line to the throne. So he was going to be king one day. He was 24 at the age of the murders, so a perfectly acceptable age to murder. I don't know what the average murder age is, but when I saw his age, I was like, yeah, that's, he's developed. He can do it. Fun fact about Prince Albert, again, if you've been listening to our other or reading our other content, Queen Victoria, of course, wanted to marry Albert off to another one of the royals, as they usually do. And she really wanted him to marry her granddaughter, so his first cousin. Awesome. Yes, love it. Again, this was only 100 years ago, not that long. And that person was Princess Alex, who declined his offer. And she declined his offer because she was in love with someone else. And that person was Tsar Nicholas of the Romanovs. And she became the last Tsarina of the Romanovs.
Wow.
Yes. You brought up a fascinating theory for those who are as obsessed with the Romanovs as we are, that, spoiler alert, if Prince Albert had become king, which he didn't, we'll talk about that. If he had become king of England, having this affection for Alexandra, would he have intervened in their murders or, the tragedy? And I had never thought of that. And now it's like just in my brain. Like,
yeah, because there's really very little information about Prince Albert out there. And like you said, a lot of it is overshadowed by this theory that he was Jack the Ripper. And then a couple of scandals that you'll mention, I'm sure. But then the other thing is that, yeah, he was in love with, or at least Queen Victoria was encouraging him to marry
Right. He was
Alexandra.
interested in her.
Yeah, and a lot of people do think that the history of Russia could literally have been different if he was on the throne, because there
Right.
was not only the familial relationship, but the affection there.
Yeah.
And he was
Or if
loyal to.
she had accepted his proposal.
Well, yeah, that's
I mean, that
another
also
thing.
blows my mind.
Then, who maybe Jack Ripper would have been her, advisor instead of Rasputin.
Oh my gosh, the possibilities are endless. There's such a rabbit hole of what ifs when it comes to the Romanovs, but this was one of them. So, Albert is tied to the Jack the Ripper theories in two ways. One is that he was the killer himself, pretty straightforward. The other one, which seems to be maybe a little more accepted, is that the murders were carried out by a group of men, like higher up men who were close with Albert or knew him, in order to cover up a secret that Albert had. And that secret was that he had married a commoner and had a child with her. So he had this secret wife and child, and he had to hide both of them. And in this theory, one of the women who is actually killed by Jack the Ripper was a nanny to this secret child. And so, in order to keep the secret, this group of men had to murder her and anyone else who knew about it, which would be her other friends / prostitutes that were in their circle.
So is there a known connection between these women other than living in the same area and having maybe similarities in lifestyle?
I think, I mean, it was I don't want to say it was a small area, but people's paths did cross.
Yeah, because
So
I read
there,
it was like one of the most densely
yeah,
populated
yeah,
areas in
exactly.
London. So
So
if you were
there was
neighbors.
a loose connection in the way that people probably knew of each other or crossed paths or knew the same people. So
Mhm.
so that part is not unlikely. Um, one of those co-conspirators was said to be Winston Churchill's father, um, and just the likelihood that Churchill Sr. and a group of other men went out and just killed 5 women within 3 months that specific way. Like, so, I mean, I get the theories that they wanted to distract from his other stuff, and boy, did they. But
Yeah, we'll talk about it.
um,
It's not like a normal way to kill someone, and especially
right,
in those times before serial killers and like true crime was out there. I don't think
right.
Churchill Sr. was coming up with that little plan on his own.
Yeah, it's extreme. There were clearly underlying motives. We're going to talk about that to these murders. Um, Queen Victoria knew that the murders were happening. She's the queen. I hope she would. Word traveled to her. She was very concerned. She started writing her own letters to law enforcement with her suggestions. She was getting into it. Perhaps she was also fascinated along with the rest of the country. And so she had her own theories and suggestions. Her theory was actually one of the ones about how there were ships docked and that it could have been people from the ships coming in and out. So, but what she didn't realize is that her prized grandson was on that list of suspects for some people. His name was in the tabloids, and there's not really hard, credible evidence for Albert, but there is some reason why he was tied into that, and he did have kind of a juicy social life, if we can say. His name had floated around in some pretty high profile scandals at the time. One of them was a raid on a male brothel. He was said to be a client. I think the theory of him possibly being gay came up multiple times throughout his life.
Yep.
And, back then that was, against the law. It was a sin, all this stuff. So, um, And then he had supposedly had dalliances with some common women, including one which was at least one who was a dancer, and she committed suicide by poison. So, like, maybe as a result of that relationship, it's unclear. So his life was not clean when you pulled back the curtain, and that is probably what led to some people throwing his name in the mix. Because we're going to talk about, you're going to talk about, some of the possible motives behind these types of murders, what, the mind of a murderer, and how it ties into what people thought of, um, at, at this time could have contributed to those murders.
Yeah. So to start off, I guess let's talk about that, the psychology of a murderer. I think everyone wants to get inside the mind to understand like how a person could be capable of these things. And this is a whole field that I am personally fascinated by. There's that whole show Mindhunter that was on Netflix. There's a book about this, but this is basically the FBI pioneered the field of criminal profiling, which is using clues and information about the crimes themselves to then deduce what that says about what type of person probably committed these crimes, and then that helps you identify suspects.
Mm-hmm.
So if you, working backwards, if you read like people's theories and interpretations of the crimes, you get like really crazy information, and this is even from like articles at the time, not even if you go on Reddit now. So ranging from like, this is the most perfectly executed crime of all time, it's a psychopathic genius and he was able to evade the police and wrote these letters taunting them, etc. And then on the other hand, it's like, this was a complete madman, they were not planned well, he got very lucky, probably someone suffering from schizophrenia who like didn't even know what he was doing, it's just like a blind rage. So to kind of clear that up, I looked and found there was an FBI profiling report done in 1988, so 100 years after the murders. Their group actually did this kind of as an exercise. And here's what they say about who their suspect likely was. So a white male in mid to late 20s, raised by...
Albert's 24.
Correct, yeah, so that one tracks. Some of these will, some of these won't.
White male, so far, not great for Albert.
So far good. Raised by a domineering mother and an absent or weak father. Domineering mother, for sure. I don't really know if his father was weak.
All fathers were absent back then.
This is very true. He would be withdrawn and asocial and have exhibited some typical psychopathic behaviors in childhood, like setting fires and torturing animals. I'm not going to go into psychopathy today. If you're interested in personality disorders, we do have the episode on Napoleon Bonaparte where I touch on this a little bit. But so I don't know that he set fires and tortured animals. I do know he was a little withdrawn as a child. It seems that he did not do well with his studies. He was unfocused and aloof, and his parents were not really happy with that. As the future king, they would want him to be very focused. So this did cause some difficulty for him. The FBI also suggested that he probably worked as a butcher, medical assistant, or mortician, something where he could feed morbid curiosity. There are some people who claim that he was probably a surgeon because of what he did to the women's bodies, but
he knew where the body parts were.
Yes. However,
he removed kidneys and some very specific things.
Right. However, the FBI contends that from their reviewing the like crime scene photos and evidence that it wasn't like as clean or did not have the level of anatomy knowledge that you would expect from a surgeon. So they think like someone who's a butcher or works in a hospital but is not themselves a surgeon, it's more like that level of knowledge.
Can confirm from the photos.
Yeah, okay, great.
Sorry.
Low self-esteem due to some abnormality that's probably really slight, either like some issue with speech or having a facial mark or even being like above or below average height. I know Albert was above average height. And like I said, he did have probably what we would say is a learning disability. So that one could actually track. Lived and worked in the Whitechapel area where the murders occurred. And then importantly, they think that the letters that were mailed to the police under the name Jack the Ripper were not from the actual killer. They don't think that this killer would have actually wanted to challenge law enforcement in any way.
Yep.
So like we said, some of those track with Prince Albert, but I think they would have tracked with like half of London or more. There's some big ones that don't. Like obviously he was not a mortician. He was in line to the throne.
He didn't have a job.
Yeah, he did not live in the Whitechapel
area. He was
area.
in the military, though.
He was in the military, yeah. And actually, I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Okay. But yeah, he wasn't living in Whitechapel. He could have made himself fit in, I guess, but like he's not part of that world at all.
Right.
So, going off of that, I don't think we would jump out at Prince Albert as a suspect. But as you said, there's no hard evidence, and this theory has endured for so long, and I really wanted to understand why that was. And what I kept coming back to was there was a 1970 article published by a doctor, a cardiologist named Dr. Thomas Sowell, and he claimed to know the identity of Jack the Ripper. He doesn't reveal it by name in his article, but he was friends with a woman named Caroline Ackland growing up, who was the daughter of the doctor to the royal family named Sir William Gull.
At the time? The doctor at the time?
He was the doctor during...
And he knew the daughter of the doctor at the time to the royal family?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And he was like born in the 1890s, I believe, maybe late 1880s. So I don't know if Caroline was alive at the time, but her dad was the physician to the royal family during the time of these murders. And according to the information that Dr. Sowell was given, Dr. Gull was seeing a patient during the Jack the Ripper murders who he described as a gay man who had contracted syphilis at the age of 16 while traveling in the West Indies. The syphilis had spread to his brain. He was dying of it. And he became convinced that this particular patient was Jack the Ripper and worked with law enforcement to actually hide that information. So while Thomas Sowell didn't name the suspect in the article, it wasn't very hard for people to put together, and the Sunday Times immediately published an article saying that this suspect was Prince Albert Victor. I mean,
why else would you want to cover up that?
Yeah, why would you want to cover it up? And then you have it's the doctor to the royal family, so it's very likely he was seeing him as a patient. Like you said, there were rumors about Prince Albert's sexuality, so him being a gay man fit. And then this story of contracting syphilis at the age of 16 in the West Indies is actually very specific. As you mentioned, he was in the military, and when he was 15 years old, he went on an expedition, or not an expedition, but on a trip with the Royal Navy and his brother to the West Indies. So that lines up perfectly as well.
Wow.
So also
it's really not looking good for him.
They describe, or Thomas Sowell described his mom in this article as a Victorian powerful matriarch, which hello, you can't get Victorian. She was literally the Victorian.
Yeah. I guess it was his grandma, but still.
His grandma, but yeah, so I thought that was pretty funny. I did find information that actually Dr. Gull, who, gave this information that his patient was Jack the Ripper, was actually thought to be Jack the Ripper by some people. He was seen in Whitechapel around the time of some of the murders. So that is something I would love to investigate further, but I did stumble upon that maybe Dr. Gull actually had something to do with it, and he was kind of trying to deflect.
I never heard that.
Yeah, I didn't have time to dive into like the sightings of him in the Whitechapel area and why he claims he was there, but it's definitely suspicious. So do that what you will.
My mind is just
Yes.
blown at the moment. Okay. All right.
Okay. So let's talk about this piece of syphilis of Prince Albert. Did he
A
have
piece.
it?
A piece of it.
Um, there's just a sliver of syphilis.
Just a slice
Uh,
of syphilis.
but this comes up whenever you look at the connection between Prince Albert
Yep.
and the murders. So first of all, I think we're all pretty familiar that syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease or infection is what they refer to now. It's caused by a bacteria. It's part of a family called spirochete that cause a lot of very serious infections. And it goes through a series of different stages. So it's caused by contact with people who are infected and these sores that are formed. So the primary or first stage of the disease is after you have a point of contact, you will form a painless scab at that point. Usually this is in the genital area or mouth. I think you can figure that out on your own. And it will heal over the course of several weeks just on its own. Oftentimes it's in areas people aren't even aware that they have these. And then in the secondary stage of disease, there are rashes that form like on the trunk of your body and then they spread out to the limbs. And at that point, people might notice flu-like symptoms, fever, aching, weakness, fatigue, etc. And then those will go away and the virus or the bacteria rather can just kind of hang out in your body dormant in what's called the latent stage. And it can reactivate like years and years later in the tertiary stage, which is, if syphilis went untreated all this time, the bacteria reactivates and it can be life-threatening, leading to damage of your vital organs. Today we treat it with penicillin. That obviously was not around during Albert's lifetime. So if he did have syphilis, it would have been untreated and then likely progressed to these later stages of disease. Although you'll probably talk about his death. There are rumors that he died of syphilis. It doesn't seem like that was the case, but it certainly is possible. And there were some earlier treatments, but again, those were not developed in the 1880s. So very possible that he had untreated syphilis. And then Dr. Soule claims that the royal physician noted that the syphilis had spread to his brain. So neurosyphilis occurs in up to 40% of patients with untreated syphilis, and it can happen at any stage of the disease, depending on when the virus gets into the nervous system, into the brain, into the spinal cord, and how far you are in the syphilis disease progression, you can get different symptoms. So
it could happen like in the second stage. It doesn't have to be the farthest progression.
Correct. So, so you can have it in a matter of days where the bacteria enters your nervous system, and it's possible for it to get into your nervous system and then nothing happens. You're just asymptomatic. It's also possible that weeks or years after infection, you have inflammation of the meninges, which we talked about recently in the Taisho episode, was it? I believe so. Yeah. So that'll give you classic symptoms of meningitis: stiff neck, headache, fever. Then there's another variation also on the time scale of weeks after being infected with syphilis, which is a meningiovascular. So it's very similar to a meningeal presentation of neurosyphilis, but it also has strokes. And then there's general paresis, which is a personality and mood change presentation, which is what we'll be focused on today. That occurs between 3 and 30 years after you get infected with syphilis. So it's rather drawn out. However, it would fit into the timeline since this doctor claimed that Albert had contracted syphilis at the age of 16. This is now 6 years later when the Jack the Ripper murders occurred. And then there's tabes dorsalis, which is 5 to 50 years after primary infection, and that affects more of the spinal cord and nerves. So you get pain in your limbs and difficulty with your balance and coordination. Interestingly, I found this in my research. I thought it was really cool. The author of Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle, I did not know was a doctor, and he graduated in the 1880s from medical school, and he had written a thesis on neurosyphilis, specifically on tabes dorsalis. So this idea of neurosyphilis was very prevalent at the time because just the way the Industrial Revolution was happening in England, there was a lot of social and economic change, and prostitution was very prevalent, and thus sexually transmitted infections.
There was no cure.
No cure. So this was just being spread a lot and then spreading to the brain a lot. Okay, so my understanding with this whole syphilis and Prince Albert, Jack the Ripper story was that syphilis had basically driven him mad, and that is why he was committing these murders. So that would go along with general paresis, that the one that I mentioned causes mood and personality changes. It's a very fascinating disease. We don't see it a lot anymore because syphilis is treated, but it is common in certain populations like those with HIV who have impaired immune systems. And interestingly, syphilis rates have been increasing for over 20 years in the US, which I found out while researching this. So it's
wrap it up.
Stephanie. Okay.
Hey, it's a PSA. Be safe. Be safe out there, kids.
Just abstinence is the best way to not.
Do not.
Okay. So that being said, general paresis was known famously as the great imitator, meaning that it can look like a lot of other psychiatric conditions, especially schizophrenia, bipolar, and dementia. It begins in the early stages with things like headaches, irritability, forgetfulness, and then in the end stages, you get like lack of emotional control, delusions, paranoia, hallucinations. And we see even today that general paresis gets misdiagnosed as other psychiatric conditions. So I found a 2016 study of 100 patients with general paresis in China, and it showed 3/4 of them had psychiatric symptoms, and nearly 40% had been misdiagnosed initially as having a psychiatric disorder.
Wow.
Why exactly does syphilis cause all of these diverse psychiatric symptoms is something that's not totally clear. But as we've talked about in the past, inflammation can have a huge effect on the brain. And when bacteria gets into the brain, you're going to get inflammation. So in general paresis, there's damage to the blood-brain barrier that helps protect the brain and keep bad things out, keep good things in. You get the immune cells from the outside of the brain coming in and causing a lot of inflammation. And this all just leads to stress and inflammation that can damage neurons, leading to cell death. I think that it's worth maybe zeroing in on one presentation of general paresis because, as I said, it can be so diverse. And then that can kind of show us how syphilis can mimic these other diseases. So the one that I'll talk about is Alzheimer's disease. That's a common disease that gets misdiagnosed. General paresis will get misdiagnosed as dementia. And if you look at the brains of people with general paresis and Alzheimer's, there are really a lot of similarities. So patients with general paresis will have shrinking in certain areas of their brain, especially the frontal and temporal lobes that are important for language and planning and higher executive functioning, and as well as the hippocampus, which is the memory region that's usually associated with Alzheimer's disease. So we're seeing pathology in the same areas. And then if you look at the tissue of patients with neurosyphilis, they're actually showing, like on a cellular level, the same pathologies that we see in Alzheimer's disease. So I believe we discussed this in our Henry VIII episode, but there's changes in proteins that happen in the Alzheimer's brain. Primarily, you get clumps of these proteins called tau and amyloid beta, which eventually lead to difficulties with neuronal communication and cell death. And you see these same tau pathologies and amyloid beta pathologies in people with neurosyphilis. So one study found that out of 23 neurosyphilis patient brains that they looked at, 19 of them had tau pathology and 5 had amyloid beta pathology. So there's this link between the infection and pathology that drives dementia.
So it's not like far off that those two things would be misdiagnosed. They sound like they present very similarly.
They're very similar. And like I said, many people don't know that they have been exposed to syphilis or that they have syphilis. So, yeah, if there is no reason for you to suspect that, then Alzheimer's disease will make a lot of sense as a diagnosis. And then interestingly, in that same study where they were looking at brain tissue, they found protein pathology associated with other neurodegenerative diseases like Lewy body dementia and amyotrophic ALS. So this has actually been used to support a broader theory of Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative diseases that are characterized by this protein pathology. That some people think that Alzheimer's disease is caused by a virus or a bacterial infection that over time is triggering inflammation in the brain that can lead to this protein misfolding and just kicking off the cascade of molecular events that happen leading to dementia. So it does seem that the inflammation that's happening in the case of neurosyphilis can really just cause a lot of damage that mirrors different diseases that would cause mood changes, that would cause changes in cognition, and ultimately would lead to large scale changes, but probably not those that would lead you to kill a bunch of women in Whitechapel in the 1880s in a very horrible way.
Right. Because mood changes, it could lead to violence in some way.
And
we talked about how, like, if you're schizophrenic doesn't mean you're necessarily violent, but aggression maybe is a better word.
Yes, and I think that is an important point to bring up because, like you said, it is associated, neurosyphilis can be associated with increased aggression. According to the CDC, there is a higher rate of syphilis in the imprisoned population than those that aren't incarcerated. I think the better explanation for that is a lot of common factors between contracting a sexually transmitted infection and committing a crime. Like poverty is probably the top one. So I'm not going to say that neurosyphilis leads you to murder. It's tricky because neurosyphilis has been a theory associated with a lot of prominent historical figures that are problematic, had tempers, even been violent. So Henry VIII, we kind of went with a different theory in his episode, but some people thought that was the case with him. Ivan the Terrible. I found it really interesting. Al Capone actually did have neurosyphilis. And people have speculated that that's why he did what he did. I'm not as convinced. These are very organized crimes that we're talking about.
Also, those specifically, I'm sure I know Ivan Terrible killed people, but like those 3 people ordered people to be killed.
Right. That's another good point.
Whereas Jack the Ripper did it himself in a very methodical way that was very purposeful and clearly thought out and planned.
Yep. Yep. So that being said, I did want to suggest that there's another way that syphilis could have played a role in the case. And I think that's illuminated by a different suspect who is named Thomas Cutbush, who was also thought to have syphilis. But in this case, the motive was not that he contracted neurosyphilis, lost his mind, and started killing women. It was rather that he was upset that he had contracted syphilis from having sex with a prostitute, and therefore the murders were a form of revenge for him. Just to highlight that, the British tabloid The Sun at the time of the murders wrote that, quote, everybody who has studied this class of crime knows that syphilis is a most significant impelling motive towards the murder of fallen women, fallen meaning prostitutes. So to me, that's more plausible that syphilis played a role in being a motive rather than some sort of trigger for all of a sudden being a serial killer.
And if you've watched any episodes of Law and Order SVU, that is a very common theme among the perpetrators, is that they are, and the Gilgo Beach murder also particularly, that was thought to be, I don't know if he contracted an STI, but he was specifically killing prostitutes as like some type of teaching them a lesson or like punishing them for, but you know, so then they don't change. But anyways, so I was gonna say also, can we just talk about how the sun has been wreaking havoc for hundreds of years
specifically on the royal family,
in the royal family in Great Britain? I mean, this publication does not sleep.
Some true staying power.
Incredible. Good for them. Yeah, I think I think it is there. It's fascinating that when you do search for Prince Albert, one, Jack the Ripper comes up, and two, the fact that he had syphilis and or was gay or, you know, involved with.
Yeah, I should mention we don't have any evidence other than the royal physician's story that he did have syphilis.
Right.
So it's very possible Prince Albert did not have syphilis. I think the kind of scandals in his past, the questions of his sexuality, and then the fact that he was misunderstood as a kid, that he, you know, had trouble with his education. I think people kind of had their own perception of him, and unfortunately, like, we'll never know whether that was the truth. I did read kind of like the only nice thing I read about Prince Albert, so I wanted to share that, was his dad sent him to college hoping like to straighten him up, and he had a tutor there, which kind of became the first rumor about his sexuality, was that he was in love with this tutor. But really, it seems like the tutor was the first person who saw any potential in him and kind of understood what we now know, or like he struggled with learning disabilities. He also had epilepsy as a child, which we've talked about in past episodes, could have affected his ability to learn. But he said that Prince Albert had a huge capacity for empathy. So really the opposite of what we know would be true about Jack the Ripper.
Right. But what we do know is that back then, like what everyone agreed on, even though they couldn't agree on who the murderer was, they all agreed that it was some type of like crazed sex maniac. Because why else would you specifically target women and then mutilate their bodies in this way? And so again, that goes back to like them thinking that Albert was some type of sex crazed maniac, you know, traveling the world, contracting diseases. Yeah, unfortunately, you mentioned you could only find like one nice thing about him. Unfortunately, Albert, he died shortly after the Jack the Ripper murders. He died at age 28. It is a little bit unclear what he died from. If you believe the syphilis rumors, some people believe he passed from syphilis. It's more likely that he passed from some type of respiratory disease, whether it was pneumonia. There was a worldwide pandemic going on at the time of his death that is eerily similar to the COVID pandemic. It killed a lot of people worldwide. And he did display a lot of those symptoms. So that's what historians believe he did pass away from. So he did not become king, and he really didn't get to do anything that significant with his life that would allow it to distract from all of the other nasty and unfortunate rumors about him.
The
rumors. So I always hate when I'm watching a documentary or a show and they're like, we don't know who killed him. Sorry that you spent the last hour with us. And that's basically what happened here. But nevertheless, I think it's fascinating because even though we don't know who the killer was, we do know some things from studying the brain and potentially his personality. And we say his because there are a couple of people that thought at the time it could have been a woman, but I think we're all in agreement that it's a he.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not the work.
So there are some things about whoever the killer was that we can all agree on. A lot of these rumors they're just fascinating to think about that, was this person mentally ill? I mean, they killed 5 people, so something was going on there. Was it?
But probably not in the way that people at the time thought. Yeah.
Agreed. Again, because it presented itself very similarly. So, having those similar characteristics. So, if you have any theories about who Jack the Ripper was, feel free to send them our way. We could be cracking the biggest cold case of the last 1,000 years just in time for the holidays.
Yeah, and taking down Lewis Carroll, finally.
Screw that guy. I'll never get that time back. Actually, I blame my ex because he was like, this is my favorite book. And I was like, oh, Hunk, I'm dating you.
Well, that wasn't
read your favorite book. And then I read it and I'm like, gotta break up with this guy. Something is not right. And I was right.
Please ask your man if they enjoyed Through the Looking Glass.
No, my current man doesn't read, so we're all good.
No. I'm saying for everyone else out there, need to make sure to ask that this holiday season.
Yep. Yeah. If they know what that book is, that's one red flag. If they've read it and they like it, then I would suggest thinking about who you want your New Year's kiss to be.
Perfect man.
Yes.
He liked Through the Looking Glass.
He was a 10, but he liked Through the Looking Glass. Oh, classic. Well, happy holidays. Whatever you celebrate, wherever you are. And we look forward to catching up in the new year of 2025. Yeah.
We're leaving murder behind, so don't expect this again.
Well, are we?
Can we really ever?